What would people say about this life I choose? What would people say if I asked them to?
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to People Say, a podcast where I unpack the challenges of launching a career in a creative field. Our next guest is a hit-making Scottish musician and songwriter signed to Sony ATV. As an artist, he began his career by winning the BBC talent competition Fame Academy. His first single, Stop Living the Lie, was #1 in the UK and sold over 250,000 copies. After releasing his first and only album, which spawned another 3 top 40 UK hits, David switched gears to focus on writing songs for others. Since then, he has collaborated with an impressive number of top-rate artists, including Lana Del Rey, Sam Smith, James Bay, Lewis Capaldi, and many, many more. It is my great honor to welcome the incredibly prolific David Sneddon to the podcast.
Hello, Ben. Thank you very much for having me. That was a lovely and slightly embarrassing introduction.
Oh, embarrassing? Why embarrassing?
When you hear someone else sort of make a very small list about your own achievements and the things that you've done, it sort of puts it in a whole other context. It's a very strange. Obviously, I'm aware that I've done those things. It's funny. It almost feels like you're talking about someone else.
Wow, how fascinating. And I don't think this list even really scratches the surface of your achievements. It's just like a quick snippet.
The highlights.
Well, you've got, just from my research and knowing you, you've got a pretty inspiring story, and we want to get into that today. And we're going to take it back all the way from the start, man. Like, you were born in Paisley, Scotland.
That's right, yeah.
Talk to me about your childhood.
Very modest, I come from a very working class background. Paisley's a small town, kind of a factory town on the outskirts of Glasgow. More people, I suppose, are familiar with Glasgow in Scotland. A lot of people might be familiar with something called the Paisley pattern. You know, you'll get a Paisley shirt that actually comes from my hometown. And so we had a big weaving industry, textile industry. And so that was very much that working class ethic. Is very much throughout my town. And yeah, grew up in a modest little flat with my mum, my dad, my sister, and quite a normal childhood, with the exception that quite early I sort of developed this aptitude, I guess, for music. My dad tells this story, right? And I swear I don't know if it's been exaggerated or romanticized, but my dad says it's true, so I can only take him at his word, that when I was ridiculously young, like we're talking about before I could talk, I think before I could walk, I could crawl. And my dad is a Beatles fanatic, and he had old 45 singles, you know, the old records, and he would put them all out on the floor. And he would put all the sleeves out, so that, you know, obviously I couldn't read, but all the sleeves for virtually every single Beatles single. And he would put one on the record player. And apparently, without hesitation, I would crawl over to whichever Beatles 45 it was and pick out the song. And there is no one in my family with any musical ability. So I guess for them, it was a bit of a novelty. And that music was all the way through my childhood. Like, my dad was obsessed, like I said, obsessed with the Beatles, but also just obsessed with the classics. So I would listen to Elton, I would listen to Stevie Wonder, especially Sinatra. You know, those sorts of, I guess, singers who have that expression. I know Sinatra wasn't a writer, but the other guys who wrote those songs, that was my education. I didn't go to any sort of special, you know, musical school or anything. My education in music was classic records. I probably still take that with me now, to be honest.
So did you have instruments in your house that your parents were enabling you to have piano lessons, or at what point did you transvert that musical passion into, okay, let me start playing some instruments?
We genuinely came from quite modest means. So, you know, my mum and dad wouldn't have been able to afford a piano or send me to piano lessons. So, we, I think, don't get me wrong, my mum and dad, you know, always made sure that my sister and I, you know, we didn't live in poverty. You know, they worked all their lives. They made sure that my sister and I always had food in our mouths. And when I started to show that musical aptitude, they did what they could, which was basically buy me a tiny Casio keyboard. I remember it so vividly. I mean, it must have had like 20 keys. and like a weird little early computer cartridge that had I think it had 4 pieces of classical music, including Green Sleeves. I remember that really clearly, and 4 Beatles songs, and then little LEDs along the bottom. And what you could do is you could play the tune. And remember, one of them was PS I Love You. So you could put on PS I Love You, and then the lights would come on the keys. So I would sit and learn how to play the melody for PS I Love You along with the backing track. I think I got that keyboard when I was maybe like 6 or 7. Again, another one of these stories that you don't know if it's true. But again, my dad swears that, I got that on Christmas, and by Christmas night, by Christmas evening, I could play, having never played a piano before or a keyboard before, I could play 3 or 4 of the songs without the lights. I had just learned to memorize the melody on the keys. And again, it's funny, even today, having never had any training at all as a piano player, I'm entirely self-taught. I'm taught by Elton John. That's definitely my piano style. But I still will listen to something and pick it up by ear and play it pretty quickly. I mean, I'm not saying play me some classical music and I'll sit and I'll play like some sort of virtuoso piano player, but I can pick up melody really quickly. And I'm sure that's where that comes from. For me, that was my first real taste at, I suppose, becoming a musician. And then it wasn't until I got to high school that I got access to a real piano. And then that sort of changed everything again.
You mentioned you grew up in Scotland from very humble beginnings. How did that affect your childhood? And I guess I've come to realize that, and I've noticed this about myself, but about lots of artists, is that they experience some kind of hardship in their lives. And that really kind of motivates the songwriting, the playing. It makes you dive in headfirst to your passions, which in this case for you and for me is music. Did your upbringing in Scotland profoundly affect you in that way?
100%. I look at myself sometimes. I've lived in London now for 18 years. I still call Scotland home. I still call Paisley home, even though, I'm here for such a long time. But my entire drive, for someone who's fairly easygoing and quite easy, I'm sure you'll testify to, fairly easy to get on with. I've got this unbelievable drive that comes from that upbringing. I'm not going to say it was ever a desire to get out. I don't think I was like, working to leave that place. But in some regards, that's true. Because I wanted to do, when I finally figured out I wanted to do music, I felt like I couldn't do it there. And then also as much as I'm not ashamed of where I'm from at all, and I'm proud of my working class upbringing. I don't think at any point when I was going, a lot of my best mates back then, we all met outside of school. Actually, a lot of my best pals were because I joined this youth theatre group, and they all came from very middle class backgrounds, and they all had these massive houses. And I definitely remember a moment where I was looking at my house, sort of age 12. All my friends had these massive houses, and I was like, how do I get that? What do I do to be one of those guys? And that definitely, that drive came from that upbringing. And like I said, my mum and dad were incredible, and anything I wanted to do or anything I wanted to try, not just music, I was really into sport. They supported, they took me everywhere, they drove me everywhere I had to be. So and like when I did start to show an aptitude for it later on, that expanded outside school. But that drive, man, definitely came from my beginnings and where I'm from.
That makes sense. It's not overly surprising. You mentioned you got into theater, and I was reading that you were quite into theater. How does that connect to your journey?
I suppose when you're young, I had a love of the arts generally. I didn't know it was the arts, but I was so into things like creative writing, for example. In fact, at one point when a high school teacher had said to me, "Oh, you should consider writing," but he was talking about, like novels and stories and stuff, because I was really into creative writing in English. At the same time, I had joined this youth theatre. And at the time, as much as music was definitely my drive, I didn't quite know at that stage how to channel that. It wasn't like there were loads of guys around me picking up instruments to join a band. That didn't happen, till much later, till my late teens. So at that age, 12, 13, there was a youth theatre in Paisley Youth Theatre. And I just found that being on stage was a buzz. And not only was it a buzz, but girls liked it. And it was like, yeah, man, I can get on board with this. And so I really took to acting, actually. I really enjoyed being on stage. I had a great social group within that theatre as well. Like all my best friends today are from back then. None of us are actors. Apart from I did 1 year with James McAvoy, and he's obviously done quite well. But none of us are actors. We're all in various different jobs. Most of them aren't even in a creative field. But it was the social element of that, and I enjoyed it a lot. And like I said, being on stage was great. A nice segue, I suppose, is the musical director of that theatre company became just one of the most influential and important people in my life. He was definitely responsible for me writing songs. I always knew I could perform, but I didn't know I could write. Being part of that youth theatre really sort of changed my life, actually.
I'm definitely interested to unpack this guy you're talking about a bit more. It sounds like he profoundly changed your life. Let's hear about him and what his impact was on you.
Again, back then, I wasn't training in music. There was no way I was ever going to, once high school was over, I was ever going to go into, college and try music or whatever. And a lot of these now contemporary songwriting, courses didn't exist back then. The UK now actually has got a really good program for people like me, or people like I would have been after high school, to go and train in production, songwriting, contemporary pop music. That didn't exist back when I left school. So in the youth theatre, there was a guy called David Ramsey. I just remember, the way I remember Dave, he's unfortunately no longer with us. He passed away a few years ago. But the way I always remember Dave was everybody would be heavily into the production. These shows that we did were always really good, really successful, quite big. And Dave was the only guy who was responsible for all the music. And they were always like all singing and dancing numbers. And he had this, again, quite a modest little setup. He was an excellent piano player and guitarist, but he sort of recorded everything to floppy disk back then, and would basically have to wait for his cue when people were on stage and just press play. And like he had no interaction really with the track. Imagine now you'd have Logic set up and you'd be able to do so much. He would just press play on a floppy disk, and that would be his cue. I just remember from being on stage, never mind the rehearsals, he had his one, you could see him from the stage. There was this dark little corner, like up in the eaves of this theatre. And I could always see him. And when it came time to play guitar, he'd put his guitar on. Nobody would watch him. And it blew my mind. I was like, man, this guy's doing everything up there. Every song that's coming on right now is from him. He's written it, every melody, every lyric, every chord. He's playing live guitar, and he's made this whole track. I didn't have a clue about production or songwriting back then, but that's what he was doing in a different job from mine, but that's what he was doing. And one day when I was about 16, I went and asked him about it, and he sort of showed me roughly, well, you can record piano by doing this, and you can. And I wrote a song. It was called Goodbye, and it was very sad. It wasn't really about anything, but it was the first song I'd ever written, and I found it remarkably easy. And I remember at the end of it going, wow, I was so proud of it. I could probably, having not thought about it for, over 20 years, I could probably sit down and play it. I was so proud of it, and so proud that I'd made it. And he was really encouraging of it. And from that point onwards, he sort of took me under his wing. The acting totally fell out of my head at that point. I was all about music. And also I discovered at that point that I really had a voice, a singing voice. Yeah, from that point onwards, man, he taught me how to write, really. That chance and encounter just through a youth theatre. Again, you have all these little moments in your life that, set you on your path. But he, without question, was like just one of the most influential people that I've ever met. I wish he was still around, because I think he'd be sort of fascinated to know what I'm doing now. But anyway, it was, what a thing.
That's remarkable, man. It's interesting you say you remember the first song you've ever written, because most writers I know do not. And it must have been quite a song.
No. Fucking terrible. Thank goodness I've gotten better at my job. but I remember it.
You mentioned earlier when you got into high school, you found real pianos. This is around the same time, right?
I guess it goes hand in hand, really. Again, without ever having lessons, I sort of, the music department in my school, I went to a school called Glenafre High School. Again, several music teachers over the course of my sort of 6 or 7 years there, several music teachers understood that I had a bit of a talent for it, and so would always encourage me. And I spent every single interval, lunchtime, whatever, even after school in the music department, because they would allow me just to lock myself in there and play this piano. And I sort of didn't know what the chords were that I was playing. I think in this, like every person who's self-taught, I probably sort of put C, F, and G together and thought, hey, that sounds a bit like Wild Thing. and from that point onwards, I thought I could play piano. At the same time, as I was picking up those chords on a real piano, which again, as a piano player, you understand, man, if you've been playing on like a little one-note Casio keyboard, going to a full piano is like heaven. Whoa, it changes your life, man. And I don't think I'd ever played a real one until I got to high school. So it just blew my mind. So I just, from that point onwards, throughout school, I was academically okay, but I just wanted music. That was all I was interested in. Well, music and football or soccer. That was all I wanted. Yeah, taught myself roughly how to play piano. By the time I left, I could do enough to write that song that you mentioned during the intro. And at the same time, I was learning how to write songs with... it's funny, I look back on him, he was definitely a mate, which I guess is weird because I would have been like 16 or 17. Dave would have been like in his late 40s, early 50s, but there was no age barrier there. There was, I guess that's maybe why I am the way I am now too. I don't really see age as a thing. He was definitely one of my best mates back then, even though he was a mentor. He really looked out for me. So the piano playing and the songwriting all just came at the same time.
That sounds pretty incredible. It also sounds incredible that you really had limited access to a piano. You didn't have one at home, so you must have had to become really amazing at playing from the very small amount of hours you were given at your local high school or in the theater company, right?
I wouldn't say, now that I'm fairly confident now around the piano, I sort of feel like I know what I'm doing, but I still wouldn't say I could play enough to write. Actually, that's probably as good as I was. I could stick chords together to write songs. I don't think I would have said I was a decent piano player until my mid-20s, really. Because you're right, once I finished high school, I had no access to a real piano. I actually had to wait until I came to London. Actually, no, sorry, that's a lie. In the year before I came to London, my mum and dad bought like a cheap upright piano because at that point it was so obvious that was what I needed to do. But no, I had really limited access, so I don't think I was particularly great. Even when I wrote that song that became like this massive number one in the UK, I didn't really know what I was doing around the piano at that point. But my singing was definitely good at that stage, so that probably helped.
So at what moment did it become more than just a hobby? Like at some point, you must have made some kind of determination that you're going to start to pursue this more seriously, or was it more organic?
I wanted to be in music. I wasn't entirely sure how to make that happen. Again, I suppose that decision heavily came in the late 90s, and you had to be in London, really. And I had absolutely no way of getting there. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have any money. It almost felt like an impossible dream to go to London. So music wasn't, as much as I knew it was what I wanted, I didn't have the path. I didn't know how to do it. So actually, I did try a few other things. Like I went to university. I studied like journalism for about 6 months, and then I was like, nah, this is not for me. It's a waste of time. I just knew what I wanted to do. At that point, actually, I kind of got a little lucky in that I met a guy called John Keelty, who was an infinitely better musician than I was. I'm not saying that's the case now, but back then he was definitely infinitely better than I was, and we became best mates. And he had that same drive as me. His was split definitely between theatre and music, but he was so good at music that I just sort of convinced him that's what we should be doing. No matter what else you're doing with anybody else, theatre, acting, comedy, whatever, we should be doing music. And that was my first real experience of being in a band and working with another songwriter. I think most people who've sort of gone through that process of, again, I was the front man in the band. I didn't even play any instruments really. I just did the singing, but I was involved quite heavily with the direction and a little bit of the songwriting. Again, John probably did most of it back then, but I loved the dynamic. And at that point, I probably thought, oh, being in a band is the thing. That's what I want to do in my life. Whether or not I write, I don't even think back then I would have cared so much. I would have been just happy being in a band that gets signed somewhere. I still probably hadn't fully explored songwriting, even though I had started to do it. I don't think I was sitting night after night at my little keyboard just pouring out ideas. I don't think, again, that came until I was probably like 19 or 20, maybe even later, maybe even 21. I would have been 17. I think I was actually, yes, I was in my last year at high school, and he was at, we went to different schools and stuff. But from 17 until I came to London when I was 23, me and John just played. Like, we played in bands, we busked, we tried everything really within music. We wrote songs, we did shows, we tried comedy music. There was like loads of different stuff that we tried. It was incredibly creative. At the same time, I had figured out, so there's this little scene in Scotland. The best way to describe it is like, if you are like a retired factory worker, or in Scotland or north of England, it would be like the mines, guys who would work down the mines had these little clubs, and they were all like in their late 60s, early 70s, things like British Legion clubs. And it's basically just there for these old guys to go out and get absolutely hammered on a Sunday night. And they would have these little music competitions, but they were making so much money on the bar, right? These old boys were spending so much money on booze that you could go and sing in one of these competitions. And if you won it, they'd give you £1,000. Now, all my mates are working like part-time jobs while they go through university. And I suddenly figured out I can go around all these little places around Glasgow, and 9 times out of 10 I could win. And then even if I didn't win, if I came runner up or third, you'd get like 500 quid. So I was making a fortune as a unemployed like musician, just doing these little clubs and competitions. And that teaches you at the same time as well how to work the room, because that was a hard crowd. So you're doing that, and then during the day I'm out with John playing in these bands, being a real teenager. So my education definitely started musically as a performer in band. It was a total band setup. Definitely more as a singer, not a piano player.
Well, I think most songwriters who don't come from that background often forget that these songs need to be played in front of people. And the real jury is the public, not some other writer who think, oh, wow, what a great, chord progression you've got there.
Even hits, man. I remember back then, songs that I loved as a 17 or 18-year-old, I would go and play in these clubs of like 60 and 70-year-old boys, man. They let you know if they don't like the song,
That's its own kind of education for sure. During this time, so you spent, sounds like, 3, 4, 5 years really going after it. What was the general response from, your parents, your family, your friends? Do you think that they saw, obviously, you were trying to pursue this in a more serious way? Were they very, very supportive, or were they more dubious that this might not work out?
I've always had support. When I got to that point where I was doing these these old guy gigs, sort of 30, 40 miles away from Glasgow. And my dad would jump in the car every Sunday night and take me to these things. They were always supportive. And then as it went on, friends, girlfriends, even my younger sister, the support was always there. I think from my parents' point of view, there was also deep, deep concern, because there was no real music. I mean, Glasgow itself is a fucking brilliant place to play. If you want to play live, go to Glasgow. Like, you'll find an audience on a train in Glasgow. It's an amazing place to play. And Scotland in general is a great place to play live, but there's not really a music industry. Again, I think that's changed now, but back then, there were like 2 guys that you sort of knew had sort of an in. One of them was Alan McGee on Creation Records, who found Oasis, and sort of that was kind of it. There was another guy called Elliot Davis who I did meet once, who really saw himself as like a Svengali. He was quite a scary, scary guy, but there was a massive Scottish pop band called Wet, 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 and he managed them. I mean, that was all I knew. Those were the only places I could go. No publishers, no record labels, nothing. My mum and dad, probably rightly, scared that I had gotten, by the time I'd gotten to 23, at least, I'd been out of university for like 4 years, I guess. In fact, if I'd stuck at it, I would have probably had a degree by the time I got to London. And in that time, I was signing on. I was doing, like I said, I was doing those gigs. I was still writing with Dave Ramsey, the guy from the youth theatre. I was doing everything that I could do, which actually wasn't a lot, to be fair. But the sort of drive never left me for it. I never at any point thought, well, maybe I should go back to uni or theatre. Or even when I came to London, I still thought, no, it's probably going to work. I don't know why. It was baseless. I had absolutely no reason to think that. But yeah, I think the support was great. But I know for a fact my mum and dad were concerned.
That makes sense. I think every musician can identify with that in some way. So in this time, right, let's just recap a second. You're born in Paisley, you have a nice upbringing, you love the Beatles, you get exposed to Elton John, don't have a piano, you develop a love for music, get involved in the theater company. Dave Ramsey teaches you, or mentors you in writing songs. And in high school, you get some more piano expertise. Then you meet your friend John, start forming some bands, start playing around in the Glasgow greater area, graduated from high school, and we've tried a year of college, wasn't for us. Where are we? What happens? Because I know at some point you enter that Fame Academy competition. Did you move to London first, or?
No, so actually that's funny. Exactly where you're up to, right? That's where we're at. And I was 23. I had just spent the whole, so John and I had just spent the entire summer. It's actually to date, it's probably one of my favorite times in music. We spent the entire summer playing in Edinburgh. We did the Edinburgh Festival. We would busk on the streets again as unemployed musicians. We made a fortune. The best thing about the Edinburgh Festival is a lot of tourists don't understand the currency. So while you're standing on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh and most Scots are thrown in like 50p or £1, some fantastic Canadian will come along with a £20 note, not understand the value of it and just throw it in the case. And we were like, yes, that pays for a week's rent. Like, it was so good. So that summer, 23, it was glorious. And for whatever reason, Scotland, the weather is fucking terrible. That summer, it was glorious. We were out on the streets the whole time. Everybody felt great. We were poor, but we were happy. And my dad phoned me and he went, what you doing with your life? I was like, yeah. Talk about coming back down to reality. He was so right. And I said, me and John are still doing the band. And I remember it so vividly. I was with my girlfriend and he phoned me and said, what are you doing? No, we're just hanging about. And he said, there's an article in the newspaper. The BBC are making some sort of show for singers and songwriters. Now, at the time, there was no X Factor. I think there had been in the UK maybe one season of Idol, which had been won by Will Young, who was launched into stardom. This was a different time for reality TV. The way the show back then was sort of developed, it was the idea that this is a school, this is a college. This show is about taking 12 students, giving them access to, top songwriters, top vocal coaches, choreographers even. But the thing that made me go, ooh, was the Fame Academy house, the idea, this place. At the time, I didn't know what it was, but it had an inside built-in, fully functioning recording studio, which I had, at age 23, I'd never been in. I'd never been in a proper recording studio. I'd done basic recording, but never this. And I was like, whoa, that sounds pretty awesome. I mean, what else am I doing after the Edinburgh Festival? Nothing. I'm probably having to figure out what my next step is. So they held open auditions in Glasgow. And it's funny because now when you watch shows like X Factor and you see all those kids, there's queues that look like a mile long. There was maybe when I turned up, there was maybe 500 folk. I mean, they probably got through the entire audition process in one morning. But that was only Glasgow, of course. It was happening all over the UK. But even now, looking back on it, I said at the start, when you talk about those things I've done, it feels like someone else. This now, to me, I could be telling someone else's story. It's like an out-of-body experience. I can picture myself standing in that queue, going into the audition, singing my song in front of a camera, a few TV execs, leaving and going home and being like, all right. What was, I don't really know what that was. I think it was only a day or two later that I got a call saying that they'd only selected maybe 2 or 3 people from Glasgow, and I was one of them. And so now I had to go to the national auditions, which were in London. And this was my first trip to London. This was like such a big deal. In fact, I do remember feeling like, well, you know what? Even if I don't get on the show, I've made it to London, so I'll probably meet an A&R, and I don't even need this show now. I'm going to get signed. People will, notice my immediate genius. It's like, couldn't have been further from the truth. Got down to the show, the audition in London, and it was crazy. At that point, I realised what I had let myself in for. There were people from everywhere in the UK, ridiculously talented, people playing virtuoso piano, people singing in a way that I'd never heard before. I mean, the whole experience to me was just like, honestly, I do remember being like, fuck, what am I doing here? Like, I felt so out of my comfort zone. At the same time, I was also I was still confident in my singing ability. At that point, I didn't really know if I was any good as a songwriter, but I was mega confident in my voice. So that was what I did. I just sort of thought, well, if I can get through whatever the next audition phase is, singing a nice song, then maybe they'll be like, oh, he's pretty good, and they'll put me through. That happened on day 1. On day 2, again, the sort of reality check of what I was in, because kind of for the next 3 auditions, it had nothing to do with music. And again, I didn't really know what I was letting myself in for. The best way to describe it is Big Brother. It was like they wanted to know who you were as a personality after they knew if you could sing. And then it sort of became obvious that was just as important. So that's kind of like when I threw everything into the personality side. I was like, right, well, I'm going to, I'm sort of larger than life anyway. So I was like, well, I might as well just like go all in. So I was telling jokes. I remember at one point, there was some ridiculously rich guy who was auditioning, and the TV execs did this thing where they wanted to do a debate to see what you would be like on personality. And they were so clever because they obviously knew, they had all their forms and everything. They knew my background and that I'd come from, modest means. And they put me next to this rich guy, and the topic was money doesn't bring happiness, discuss. And this guy went first and said, well, let me tell you, money doesn't bring happiness because blah, blah, blah. And I was raging. I was like, I don't have it. I was like, you try being poor and happy and tell me how you feel. And I got so angry about it. And I was like, do you know what? Money maybe doesn't buy happiness, but I bet you it fucking helps. And the response, I think at that point, that probably got me a big tick next to my name because people sort of knew I would speak my mind. But then after that, we got back to the music, and I just ramped it up. And I made sure that every day when I was in there, if I knew what song I was doing, I would practice the hell out of it. Kept going through. And ultimately it got down to, we were there for maybe a week and a half. I knew I was down to like the final, let's say 15 or 20, which from thousands, even then I was like, man, that's pretty cool. Went back to Scotland. They were like, okay, we'll let you know. And I don't know if you know this, went back to Scotland and didn't get into the show. Got a phone call. Got a phone call saying, really sorry, it was close, but you haven't made it. We're thinking about like a sing-off with 3 contestants for the last place in the show. You could be one of those 3. And I was like, oh, all right, whatever. I found out later they'd already picked another 2 Scottish guys, which was probably why I didn't get in. I eventually got to that point where they had said, okay, you're going to be one of the 3 who sings to get on the show, and it'll be up to the studio audience to vote, the public at home to vote if you get into the show. And I was like, all right, okay. So it was another trip to London, myself and 2 other contestants. The other 11, there was 12 ultimately, the other 11 had already made it. And their show, it's so funny, the opening night, they were all singing and all dancing. And I was like, what the fuck is this? It was basically X Factor before X Factor. Even then I remember being like, oh, this isn't what I thought this was going to be. But, still went, had my couple of days of training, went on stage and sung Uptown Girl by Billy Joel, another, just another hero of mine, and didn't get on the show. The public voted for someone else. So this Irish girl called Sinead Quinn was the 12th contestant, and that was it. Fame Academy had made their show, 12 contestants. I went back to Scotland thinking that was it. You know, you can't get put out twice. Like, okay, that's it for me. So I went back, watched the show on TV, thought it was terrible, and felt a bit like, oh, I've dodged a bullet here. And also, I had a little bit of a opportunity that week to read how it had gone down, and it got panned. The papers, the critics, everybody hated it. And I mean, I suppose now you look back and realise that people have this natural feeling about reality TV, which I still don't understand, I have to admit, but critics just don't like it. Yeah, they panned it. And so I felt like I dodged a bullet. And then the following Sunday morning, so they'd done the one live show on the Friday night. Then Fame Academy had been on all week, every night. It was a bit like Big Brother. You get to see the students. They lived and breathed in this academy. So it was like a university, incredible people involved. And this poor girl called Naomi Roper, bizarrely a Scot, developed laryngitis in the first week. And I got a phone call the following Sunday morning, right? And I was so hungover. I was like lying in bed with my girlfriend. I got a phone call. They were like, "Oh, hey, it's the producer from Fame Academy. Naomi's having to leave. Do you want to be on the show?" And I said, "Oh, can I call you back?" I genuinely didn't. I sort of felt like, having watched the show, it might not be a great idea. And hung up, spoke to my girlfriend about it. She was like, "Well, it is what it is. It's an opportunity to go on TV. You might even only do it for 1 week. And then who knows what other doors that opens." My mum and dad obviously were the same. They were like, "What else are you going to do? You owe it to yourself after all this time to at least give it a shot. You never know who you're going to meet." And I had been, the day before, I had, again, never forget it, I had just signed on unemployment benefit to try and pay my rent because I had literally no money. And genuinely, fuck it. What have I got to lose? Absolutely nothing. And believe it or not, 12 weeks later, I had won the whole thing. I won the whole competition as like third reserve. Over the weeks, I definitely got more and more confident. I sort of proved myself in like week 3 or 4. I remember one of the vocal coaches made a comment that I looked like I should be in a boy band. So that goes against you if you are like a serious. And I was like, what? Like, I didn't understand why. I was like, Elvis was pretty good looking and he did okay. They just sort of like made that an issue. And then I sat down at the piano and played this song, Stop Living the Lie, that I had written, again, when I was 16. I wrote it in high school based around shitty little cafe that was right next door to my high school. I sat and played this song with absolutely no thought behind it. I was just like, oh, well, I do write songs. So I played this song, and sort of little known to me, like, I think the record company, all the management, everybody involved at Fame Academy went, ka-ching! They all just thought, this is a hit. And so when I won, ultimately, there was no guarantee I was going to win it. There were some incredible singers on that show. But when I did win it, the single was there. And I was lucky. I'd written it myself. There was no co-write. It was an entire 100% David Sneddon original. That was my first song. Went straight to number 1. And from that point onwards, life went pretty crazy. That's a story for you, right?
Wow. Yeah, that's an insane chain of events. I mean, you can't get that from the internet. That is mind-boggling. I did not see that happening like that at all.
Well, I think for me, the thing I'm most proud about at that time was, like I said, in Glasgow, signing unemployment benefit with no idea what I was going to do. And 12 weeks later, I had a number 1 record that I had written myself in the chart. I mean, later on that year, I didn't cope too well with everything. But the way I sort of transitioned into that, I kind of look back and give, for someone that young, I kind of give myself some credit for at least keeping it together for a little while, because it was such a life change. It was hyper fame. It was so weird.
Well, I have to imagine when you were telling that whole story, my first thought was, well, you had all those years of practice performing in Glasgow on the streets and in the bars that I cannot imagine any of those other contestants really had.
I suppose that was my education. And when you've played a lot of those kind of gigs, there's no point in sugarcoating it. They are soul destroying, because a lot of the time you realize nobody's really listening. People are just there to get drunk. And a lot of them, as much as I said earlier, those competitions, you could make some really good money. Most of them you didn't. So Yeah, I think the education and learning how to read a crowd and just how to sort of be confident in really crappy situations. You're right, that probably did, even though it was the exact opposite of that. I'm suddenly playing to these crazy crowds, but there was a kind of confidence in how I would adapt to that situation, I suppose.
For sure. It makes a lot of sense to me. So you win. Rock on. That's awesome. And then all of a sudden, I guess like happens with these reality shows, you must have gotten signed to a label deal. They must have put out the single right away.
Yeah, it was Mercury Records, Universal, who were tied into Fame Academy. Every student signed a record deal before you go into that show, and then they decide which ones they want to work with at the end. You know, a lot of those kids, I'm sure their contracts are just torn up at the end of it. But basically, I was already tied into a deal, so my first single was recorded and ready to go. Now, it obviously wasn't the best deal in the world. I'm sure had I gone into music in another way, it would have been a better deal. But I still don't have any bitterness about it because, like I said, I had nothing. So actually to be given any opportunity and to sign any record deal back then was just life-changing for me. So yeah, I didn't really have to navigate any label politics, really. It was done. And the song was recorded while I was in the academy because, like I said, they had the recording studio there. So I was able to, I didn't know I was recording it as a single, but I was able to basically do all the groundwork while we were still making Fame Academy, which is kind of crazy looking back on it now. But yeah, when it went to number one, like, again, you have those moments in your life that you sort of think, oh, when that happens, maybe it'll be like, oh my God, that's all I've wanted my whole life. So, but it's funny when they happen to you, of course, you then adapt and readjust. So that wasn't as if I was like, okay, that's me, I've made it. When that happened, I was like, that's really cool. What next? And so it's almost like you really quickly forget. And this still happens to me now as a writer. You really quickly forget the hits because you just move on to the next one. And although I'd say back then, changing into a proper recording artist, and there's no two ways about it. In the UK, you could probably only describe me as a pop star. I was definitely a pop star, which is so weird. I definitely adjusted more to the music side of that than I did the fame. The fame. And like I said, I always describe it as hyper fame because if you have 12 weeks going from nothing in Glasgow to suddenly, I think the night of Fame Academy, like something like 10 million people voted for me. You're famous everywhere immediately. It was the strangest, most bewildering experience of my entire life. The moment I remember, we had a morning off. Obviously, Fame Academy was really intense. Then I had to do some promo for the single. And my management had said, well, look, you haven't even seen London. Why don't you, your girlfriend, your mum, your dad, take a day off, go and do some sightseeing? And they organised some stuff for me and it was incredible. One of the things they organised was a pod to myself on the London Eye. Now, again, having never been to London, I was like, oh my God, the London Eye is so iconic. And you go around, you see Westminster from the London Eye, you can see Buckingham Palace. It's incredible. But while I'm looking at all these amazing things, my girlfriend sort of like kind of nudges me. She's like, look over there. And if you're aware of the London Eye, it's basically these big capsules, and you can see the ones next to you. So although we had a private one, all the others were basically full of tourists and stuff. It was like, while we're at the top, London is looking magnificent. You're just sort of looking at this beautiful city. And she noticed that all the people in all the other pods were pressed up against the glass, looking at me. And I was like, oh my God. It's the weirdest thing. I was like, have any of you noticed that Big Ben's over there? Look at Big Ben. That's pretty awesome. Don't look at wee Dave. Look at Big Ben. And that moment onwards, I realised what it was to be that kind of level of famous. It was the strangest thing I've ever gone through. Like I said earlier, it didn't take me long. It was only a few months that I decided I really didn't like it. But yeah, it was, I don't regret any of it. It changed my entire life. But yeah, I was suddenly a kind of bona fide pop star. Very strange.
I can't even imagine what that must have been like. You were a true, overnight celebrity. And it's funny because when you hear a lot of these people talking at the Grammys, they say, oh, I know it seems like I'm an overnight celebrity, but you don't see the years that I spent struggling. Well, this was a real, overnight celebrity issue.
I mean, yeah, certainly the fame was like It was 12. Well, actually, it was 10. In fact, I saying 12 weeks. It was only 10 weeks. That side of it was getting to that point. Do you know what? That's where I understand that comment. As much as I understand that winning Fame Academy changed my life overnight, that's for sure. But the 7 years before that, the slog and hard work for no reward, like, I mean, it's not even financial reward. You know, most of us in the business deal really heavily with rejection and all the psychological issues that come along with that. And as much as my mates still like to wind me up about, oh, you're not a fucking rocket scientist, you know, you're hardly a brain surgeon. It's like, I appreciate that my job, I'm so lucky, it's a hobby, but I can't explain unless you've gone through this. And I'm sure you will 100% back me up how hard this is. And it's not just the songwriting that's hard. It's dealing with everything else that comes along with it. It is so tough. And so dealing with the fame was the hardest thing I've ever had to get through. I suppose in relative terms, then you would say I've had a very easy life, but my God, the depression that came after that was, I didn't even realize it at the time how bad it was. It really, I suppose having overnight fame can really, some people deal with it fantastically. I look at young Capaldi at the moment taking over the world, and he's gone so famous so quickly. Again, it's not quick. You know, he's put in years to get to this point, but the fame happens fast, and he's so good at dealing with it. It's like he's just perfect at it. I am not. yeah. And a few of my other friends who are mega famous, same thing. They just deal so well with it, and I just didn't.
Yeah, I hear that. Well, as a side note, the song "Lost on You" is unbelievable. One of my favorite Lewis Capaldi songs. It's an absolute tune.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir.
But so you start having the fame, and it's not for you. But you still then go on and make a full album, and that has some other hits on it as well. So you continue on, at least in the short run, of at least sticking it through.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose even I felt like I had to, because not through like obligation to record company or anything like that. I felt like I owed it to myself to give it a go. Like, you don't get that opportunity. I know thousands of people who would kill to be in that position. So no, I definitely felt like, well, suck it up, you know? It's like, kind of be a man about it and do something that you love and do it professionally. And again, it's funny, my wife always tells me I should write a book, because it's amazing how I tend to sort of Forrest Gump my way into all these different situations. But I ended up making my album with Elton John's band. Now, as a 17-year-old, if you told me that, I would have given anything to do that. So no way was I going to, you know, start throwing my toys out the pram and saying, you know, I'm really upset about fame, but I get the opportunity to work with some of my absolute heroes. You know, at one point I look over, any Elton John fans listening will know, I'm looking over at Nigel Olsson on drums, an absolute hero, Davy Johnson on guitar. It was, and in essence, I'm filling in for Elton, because I'm sitting at Elton's grand piano with half of his ability. So it was a daunting experience, but I certainly wouldn't have, at that stage, I wouldn't have thrown it all away, because I still felt like musically I had something to give. I was still learning about myself as a musician. I was still learning about what I had to change about myself as a musician, having won Fame Academy. Before Fame Academy, I'm telling you, I wanted to be Chris Martin in Coldplay doing Parachutes, you know, because at that point, Coldplay, I think, hadn't even released Rush of Blood to the Head. They'd only had one record, and it sounded a lot like Radiohead, and that's what I was into. That's what I wanted to be. Now, anybody who has watched Fame Academy or knows me now will be like, no, you were like Westlife. But I had to navigate musically what it was to win one of those shows. There's no way I could have made a record like Parachutes. You know, it just wouldn't have worked. So I had to sort of like figure out, okay, I love Elton John, and all those early Elton records are still on my playlist today. I listen to them more than anything. So I was like, well, can I take elements of that, figure out what sort of that might be for someone with a pop voice, I was coached out of my accent, which is another crazy thing that wouldn't happen now. Back then, they were like, you can't sing with a Scottish accent. I was like, what? Why not? They were like, because no one will buy it. Fast forward 2 years, Paul and the Teenie comes out in the UK with the thickest Scottish accent you've ever heard, and everybody buys it. I was like, man. Yeah, there was a lot of things that happened in the making of that record that I was like, no, I got to do it. And I owe myself this opportunity to try it. And like you said, I ended up with another 3 top 20 hits in the UK. Back then, having a top 20 hit was a big deal. You still had to sell a lot of records to get like a number 3 in the charts. I remember my second single went to number 3, having sold 150,000 copies. These days, that gets you a number 1 for like 3 weeks. So like I was selling crazy records. So I had to keep going. And it led to the most ridiculous opportunities. I got to support Elton, which again, what a bucket list, like tell 16-year-old me, I'm going to be sharing a stage with Elton John. I couldn't have believed that. But that sort of took me about halfway through that year. Probably actually just after I supported Elton around about July, August time of that year. And that's when I started to really feel the effects of what fame was. I'm so fortunate now, but what fame was for me, it didn't do my mental state any good at all.
So you toured with Elton John. That's crazy, probably unbelievable. I can't even imagine. And then you start to get a little sad, depressed, dejected with the fame. And at what point were you like, I'm out, this doesn't work for me?
I mean, pretty immediately. As soon as that thought came into my head, that really, you're only talking about 7 or 8 months after I won Fame Academy, and that decision was in my head, and then that was it. I couldn't shake it. And I was committed to, I owed Mercury Records another single that wasn't on the album. I owed them a song. So I went and wrote this tune. I worked with 2 phenomenal songwriters on it. They really did their jobs well, but I'm not going to lie, man. I went in there so half-hearted with no interest in a hit, didn't have any emotional interest in the song. I didn't have any connection to it lyrically. I was just writing for the sake of writing. It was so obvious. Like when I handed it into my management, they were like, this, it's good enough it sounds like it could be a hit. It's a hit song, but it doesn't necessarily sound like it's a hit song for you. And I was like, well, yeah, I don't want to do this anymore. My management were like, what? I was like, yeah, I can't do it anymore. I can't stand being famous. And I didn't want to be ungrateful. I really, to this day, appreciated every opportunity and everything that everybody did for me. My record label, my management, my family, my friends, everybody was so supportive. And yet I was the one going, no, I can't do this. And so I think it took a long time, but I couldn't shake it. And once you put that thought into your head that, no, I have to do something about this. If I hadn't done something about it, I would be in a very different place than I was now. I'll openly admit, like for even after I made the decision, I sort of spiraled a little bit. Like I was drinking way too much. Bizarrely, I was going out and getting into fights, which is like just not in my nature. I was just doing the craziest shit. And it was just purely because I was so deeply unhappy with fame. And I remember even after I had quit, there was a Scottish newspaper called the Daily Record, and they really sensationalized it. They put front page. It was a front page story. David Sneddon, I quit. And I remember the reaction being like, there were people who obviously don't know me and don't know my reasons, but the backlash was hilarious. People were like, oh my God, every chant, you've thrown everything away. I voted for you in that show. You're so ungrateful. I mean, real anger at my decision. And I was like, well, I'm sorry, but if I keep doing this, there's a good chance I might kill myself in some way. So I feel like it was a really bizarre experience to go through. I got lucky because I think when I told people, they just knew I was unhappy. And my publisher at the time, Universal, my A&R, said, they'd given me a lot of money, my publisher, because I'd written my whole record. So they were looking at their investment and being like, what? You're quitting? But my publisher said, what about, have you thought about writing for other people? And I was like, I didn't even know that was a job. I was so green. I was so completely naive to the record industry. I was wrapped up in a bubble of being a pop star. I had written most of my own record with John Kilty from the days in the band. I didn't know professional songwriting really was a thing. I knew there was like 1 or 2 big names. Like I knew who Max Martin was, and Pam Shane, who wrote Genie in a Bottle. She was actually the Fame Academy songwriting coach. But I didn't know there were guys like me who were forging a career in songwriting. And actually just that one sentence, you ever thought about writing for other people? I was like, no, but now I am. And yeah, so that was definitely the end of that chapter as an artist. I thought, leave it behind, go into writing. And actually, I have to say, to this day, me doing this podcast, I mean, obviously, we've worked together, we're friends, so I would happily do it. But I don't do interviews. I very rarely will certainly talk about my career. I was able to find my anonymity again. It took about 10 years, and still, don't get me wrong, there are still times when I'm in Scotland or on the tube in London and I'll see a phone come out surreptitiously. There was one girl once who took her phone out on the tube and forgot to turn the flash off, and I was sitting off opposite her and the picture went, and I was like, do you want me to smile? It still happens. It surprises me now that it still happens, but it still does. But by and large, I regained my anonymity, and so I really cherish it. Interviews and I've been asked to go and do some of those fucking crazy celebrity reality shows and all that stuff, and I've just always said no, because I feel like getting my anonymity back was a massive turning point in my music career, actually.
In that case, I'm especially grateful that we were able to get you to do this. Because you have honestly an incredibly inspiring story. And it's crazy that at this point we could have ended the story and it'd be like, wow, like, David, great story, man. Like, what an incredible story you got. Cool, man. Thanks for coming on.
And now he works in a bar. That would have been like, great.
This could have been the end of the story. And instead, it's actually really, in a lot of ways, the beginning of the story, right? And so you were now what, 24, 25?
Yeah, 24. Probably about to turn 25, actually, when I made the decision. And then there was, I like to call those are like the wilderness years, because it's one thing making a decision like that, saying, I'm not going to be famous anymore, when you're one of the most famous people in the UK. I'm not going to be famous anymore, and I'm going to become a professional songwriter in a career where a lot of people will turn their nose up and feel really, a lot of people look down on reality show contestants, winners. Even although I had written my own song, I knew that people were like, oh, why would I want to write with that guy? Why would I want to write with the guy who won that show? And at the same time, I understood it. I understand that it's sort of like in people's heads, for whatever reason, that people who do those shows are talentless. And it is so untrue. Like, I work with so many kids who come through that show because they have to, because they come from poverty, because they come from backgrounds where they're not getting an opportunity, and they are phenomenal singers and songwriters, but they do X Factor, so they're talentless. It's garbage. And in fact, there are some actual artists in the UK at the moment. There's a girl called Grace Davies who was a runner-up on X Factor, I think 2 or 3 years ago. I'm telling you, man, she's one of the most talented songwriters in this country. She's phenomenal. And I guess I got lucky in that I realized that people wouldn't want to work with me off the back of Fame Academy. And my deal with Universal ran out. They didn't want to re-sign me because I wasn't writing any hits. And I was sort of still, I think actually I was still learning what being a professional songwriter is, because I could probably write one type of song very well, but the great writers can turn their hand to anything. And I couldn't do that in my mid-20s. I think I spent I must have spent 6 years with nothing. And I was still trying to write. I was still maybe experiencing what it is again to try and get into the music industry, even though I had that crazy success. During that time, I had started writing with, bizarrely, the guy who was my bass player when I was on tour, Jay Bauer-Mean, was my bass player, and he was really into production and songwriting. And actually, when I finished working, him and I started writing together. And then for the next 5 or 6 years, we really went in on what it is to write for other people. We only worked out of his spare room in his house in Surrey. And I would go there every single day, sometimes with artists, sometimes just me and him, never with anybody signed, never with anybody you would know. It was all just developing that sort of craft. And then the strangest thing happened. We wrote a couple of songs that a publisher at Sony ATV had heard, and he just liked the songs. He didn't know who'd written them. He was like, "Oh, these songs are pretty cool." And so he asked to meet us at the same time as we had started working with this band. We'd met a manager who wanted to manage us, and he was working with this young duo from Manchester called Hurts, Hurts, and they again had like one song, and so they started working with us. We went to Sony. He was like, I really like what you're doing. He liked the band, he liked Hurts, and he had this other girl, and he was like, I think you should also go and try, working with well, I'll call her by her real name. I think you should go and try working with Lizzie. And we were like, all right, cool. So at the same time as being in this little bubble of writing with all these people, the publisher said, you got to have a name. He said, I can't keep saying, oh, it's Jay and Dave. He said, and in particular, I don't think for the time being we should be saying David Sneddon. He said, because people will be like, oh, the guy from Fame Academy, why would I want to write with him? And it was harsh, but it was true. And so Jay and I came up with this name, The Nexus, which sounds really exotic. In reality, it was the name of my mate's washing machine. we were like, oh, it's the Zanussi Nexus. Yes, that's a cracking name. Maybe we'll lose Zanussi from the title. And so suddenly we became the Nexus, and it changed overnight. Like record labels were like, oh yeah, the Nexus. Yeah, we've heard of them. Oh, bullshit. We had never released any songs, but it was just that sort of way that the industry works sometimes, when it was like, oh, something new and it sounds a bit cool. And in reality, we were still, in Jay's bedroom, just kind of working with nobody. Then the craziest thing happened. We got offered a little deal from Sony. In the UK, Hurts started to release music and exploded. The first single was a smash. The first album was an absolute smash. We had written 3 or 4 songs on the first record. So suddenly the Nexus was a thing. Lizzie turned into Lana Del Rey, and we had been working on that first record. We've been working on Born to Die. We wrote like 5 or 6 songs with Lana over that period. There was annoyingly one of them got leaked. There was this incredible song called Driving in Cars with Boys, and it was leaked and it was all over YouTube, and so there was never a chance that it could get used after that. But we also worked on a song called National Anthem, which then sort of was one of the main songs and was a single, and all of a sudden those 2 things happened back to back within the space of, I think it was like maybe 6 months, those things exploded. And it's amazing how at that point I definitely had, I'd learned the craft of songwriting. At that point, I think I'd gotten good at it. But it's amazing how it's not you that changes as a songwriter. It's people's perception of you that changes as a songwriter. I was the same songwriter that I was for the 2 years previously. Once you've had a song like that with or 2 songs like that with some really cool artists, that it's like every door opens, and all of a sudden we were getting to kind of do anything we wanted. We were working with some crazy artists, and I learned a lesson from that as well. Like I know that I'm a good songwriter, I've worked hard at it, but I also have to appreciate that actually in a lot of ways that only counts for 50%. People's perception, if you want to work in this industry as a professional songwriter, the perception of you is just as important as the content that you're putting out there. And I know some phenomenal songwriters who never get that little bit of luck, that little break that changes everything. That doesn't make them bad songwriters. If anything, some of the best writers I've worked with haven't had that little moment, that little bit of luck. So yeah, the perception of who you are is so important. And from that point onwards, as the Nexus, we just sort of took off, really. Got to work on, some crazy shit.
That's obviously incredible. I want to back up for 1 second and kind of, because there was obviously like a 6-year period, it sounds like, in there.
Notice how I glossed over that.
Yeah. You were like, so we went through, and then, then Lana Del Rey, and then these huge hits, and we were cracking. But I am curious, because I think one of the reasons I started this podcast was to to learn about these things that if I were to read your Wikipedia page, they're giving this 6 years in one sentence, right?
Oh yeah. Oh, my wiki page is also incredibly inaccurate because nobody monitors it. I think at the start you said I was signed to Sony ATV. I was 10 years ago. I'm not anymore. I'm now signed with Reservoir, who are a fantastic publisher. Yeah, no, I think that those 6 years, certainly my formulative years as a writer with guys like John Keelty and David Ramsey and were crazy important. And then that 6 years of trying to be a professional songwriter with no interest and no hits was actually the most important part, because I mentioned earlier, we all understand in this side of the job what it is to put everything into a song. It's like, it's so hard to explain to people who don't do it what that is and what that means, because it's not just sitting talking about, you know, or you put some chords together or you rhymed some words. You know, the good artists and the good songwriters I work with put everything into it, to the extent that it leaves you feeling exhausted physically. You can feel physically drained, emotionally drained, and to do that for 6 years with no outcome. Like, you know, back then you were still sort of like sticking your demos on a CD on your laptop. I could have taken every one of those CDs and just thrown them out the window, and the only hit I would have had would have been like a low-flying pigeon. It's like there was literally there's nothing coming back, and you're still going through it every day. You still have to get up the next morning and be like, right, okay, today's the day that's going to change. Nope. The next day you wake up, right, today's the day that's going to change. Nope. And I suppose even having been really successful, you know, briefly as an artist, actually having to deal with the lack of success was just as hard as learning that I didn't like being famous. There's all these sort of contradictions, I suppose, in how I got here, sitting in my flat, like a lot of time by myself. If I wasn't with Jay or John, my wife was supporting us. She's my wife now. At the time, she was my girlfriend. You know, she's supporting us financially through this. Nah, I was still, I suppose, making a little bit from my music, and I had sort of, I guess, I was going through the pot of money that I had, you know, trying to live on it without making any. So that money is just going down and down and down and down and down. But like I said, my wife had a full-time job, so my girlfriend had a full-time job, so she was supporting us financially. But a lot of the time I'm sitting at home by myself. It's dark. It's really dark. And I'm a positive person. I always have been. But, you know, I've never even really tried to explain this to my mum and dad. I think they know that I went through a really hard time when I was initially down in London. But until from 2003, really, from the end of Fame Academy until 2010, living in this city, although I was surrounded by great people, felt like the loneliest place, and didn't know what I was doing. It's funny now, I can look back on it. There are pictures of me in 2007 where I've gained about, I mean, I don't know what it is in pounds, but it's about 4 stone, which is big, you know. And my mates now all say, oh, we've got pictures of Fat Dave from that time because I was sitting at home eating myself happy, going out at night, drinking a crazy amount of beer. It just wasn't healthy. But at the same time, I'm writing songs constantly. So there is also value in going through something like that. It made me a stronger person. It gave me that drive that I always had. My working class drive was almost like multiplied in that period. By the time I got my opportunity, I was going to take everything that came my way. And I just knew that as soon as the first thing happened, I'd be like, right, what do I do now? What's the next step after that? There was no way that once something had happened, I was going to stop. So those 6 years, although they were dark and hard and lonely, I think I probably wouldn't be the songwriter that I am without that experience. I'm not saying every songwriter has to go through emotional trauma, but maybe you kind of do if you want to be good at it.
Well, I think every songwriter does need to experience some kind of hurt that makes you feel like you need to express yourself in a way that only a song can. And I think that's always what makes the great songwriters great, the Dylans, the Paul Simons, is that, you know, take Bob Dylan, Don't Think Twice, You're All Right. Like, who doesn't see themselves in that song, right? I hear those lyrics and I'm like, wish I wrote that, felt that a million times, but could never figure it out or articulate it quite in that way. And so I think that is the beauty and the essence of songwriting that obviously you inherently understand, and you probably do need to experience some kind of emotional trauma or carry some kind of emotional baggage to have the capacity to express that kind of thing. And I think it also, in turn, makes it easier to express ideas that are not depressing.
Yeah, that's really true. I think you get to a point where it's like, no, I don't really have to write another really depressing song now. That's okay. The thing I love though about speaking to other songwriters, I'm sure during this podcast you probably get a lot of similarity, but when there's especially guys, especially that there's that sort of slightly machismo attitude, not so much anymore, which I love. A lot of these young guys are so willing to open up, talk about mental health, talk about the background. When I was 18, there's absolutely no way in hell I would have done that. Again, I come from that sort of working class Scottish background that, who talks about mental health? It's like, grow up. It really was that. So if you experience mental health problems, that's back then, that was my way of dealing with it. It was like, oh, just fucking sort yourself out. You're lucky to be where you are. There are people in far worse situations. Then you grow to realize, no, that's all relative. It doesn't matter if there are people in better or worse situations. Your own immediate problem is deeply serious and will screw your brain in 1,000 different ways. And you meet every writer. Personally, from my point of view, every great writer and artist I've worked with has a story. We all have them. And that's not just songwriters. People out there who aren't writers listening to this, they'll have that. They'll be like, I know what I went through and I know how I dealt with it. It's kind of fun, I suppose, for us that we have these mechanisms to get through it. You can write about it. You can talk to other guys who go through who understand. Like I said, my best pals back home, who I love dearly, don't understand what it is to go through years and years and years and years of rejection and try and come out the other side of that with a positive attitude. It's just so hard. And I love it when you work with writers and artists who get it, who are like, oh yeah, like I work with young guys who are like still in it. They're like, God, I'm still waiting on my first thing, my first cut, my moment. I think it is important to go through.
So in this dark period of your life, was there ever like any time that you were like, you know what, like, fuck this, I'm quitting?
Yeah. Every day. It would maybe only last about 10 seconds, but it would definitely be there.
So what made you keep going?
Well, then that's not only the $1 million, that's the $1 billion question, isn't it? What makes us keep going? I think for me, there was an element of, honestly, what else would I do? I'm kind of smart enough maybe to get back into university, but at that stage, it would have been as a sort of late, I guess, 28, 29-year-old. I didn't fancy the idea of being a mature student full time, like maybe doing like an evening class or something. But the thought of going back into full time education, I was like, I can't do that. And apart from that, yeah, I was trained for nothing. I wouldn't have, I'm not the bravest guy in the world. I wouldn't have been a firefighter. Like, absolutely no way. I'd be running into a burning building. So I honestly don't know. I think the drive, again, that's such a key word for me. The drive was always there. That came from my upbringing. That came from, my working class background. I still see it in myself now. So that was definitely there. The rejection almost turned the keys off, took the keys out the ignition and threw them out the window. There would have been zero drive. But I don't know. I suppose on the odd occasion where I thought, nah, I hate this. I need to do something else. I guarantee you the next day I would have been sitting at the piano because it was all that I knew. And I would have been like, man, even if nobody else ever listens to this, yeah, what else am I going to do? I didn't have any other option but to keep going. And I always had that, even when it was at its worst, I always had that little bit of self-belief. That never left me. Like that little bit of, no, you are a good writer. It's just going to take a little bit of luck. So as much as I definitely thought about packing it all up, I don't think seriously, I don't think I ever thought, no, that's it, I'm done at any point.
Well, I immensely identify with every single thing you just said.
I'm here for you, bro.
Like you were saying that, as you were saying that, I was like, this dude gets it big time. And I actually remember the first time we ever wrote together that I actually like got on the phone to my manager and I was like, this guy is a serious writer. Like, I don't say that lightly. Like I feel like I often write with a lot of people and I'm like, I don't know what this person did to get into this situation, but
Sure.
They don't deserve to be here. And no, for real, it was a pleasure, man.
Well, I think we even in songwriting terms, I think we come from a very similar place. So I think when we wrote together, there definitely was a kind of, it's, you know, we probably did more talk. It's probably like now, this is probably like our songwriting session. I think we did more talking than writing and got those songs out of there. So pretty good.
True. Well, I think that's, as any other writer listening will know, the talking is often the precursor to, you don't need to write anything. Sometimes the song writes itself in the conversation.
Oh yeah, it always does. In fact, I'm sure that was how our songs came around. We had that when you have that type of conversation. Again, it's so hard to explain to people who don't do our job, but it's almost like, right. So imagine it's like speed dating. So you know you're going to have. Most times for me, it would be 2 days. I don't like to do 1 day songwriting sessions. Very rarely I'll do it, but more often not it's 2 days. And you know, by the end of that second day, you pretty much want to have a song. I never put pressure on anybody to have it done because I think that's just really, there's no value in that. If by the end of day 2, you've got a couple of great lines, then that's fantastic. That's where you start. But more often, 99% of the time, by the end of day 2, you're going to have a song. So in that time, you have to, regardless of background, regardless of your experience, whatever that is, whatever your social experience even, you pretty much have to become friends by the end of that, by the end of that process. Because if you're not, then you're not going to get in my opinion, you're not going to get a great song unless you really understand, as a songwriter, the artist that you are working with. So over the space of these 2 days, you will feel that you've known the person for months or for years. And I think that's why you can really build these deep friendships really, really, really quickly. And feel that I work with people, I feel like I've known them for years, and I suddenly realize, we've spent I might have known you for 3 years, but we spent 2 days in a recording studio together. And I think you can be godfather to my child. It's such a weird experience, but I also love it. I love the fact that you get that bond, and there's a real kind of euphoria in making those friendships. I'm sure you get that.
Totally. I feel that with you for sure. We spent very small amount of time, maybe two days and a pint.
Yeah, that's right.
Or 2.
2 days and a pint. That's probably true.
Pints are key.
Yeah, man.
Well, we basically have your big story. Obviously, you went on to continue to be successful in writing, and as interesting as that is, the interesting part to me and what the focus of this podcast is about the struggle, right? Now you're working with big musicians. I mean, you had a cut on Lewis Capaldi's record, which is just stratospheric, and who knows what you're working on now. But I just have a few tying it in a bow questions that I'm curious to get your take on.
I would much rather talk about that than the songwriting. That's fantastic. Let's do that.
So how much of your career success do you attribute to luck versus hard work and talent?
I can answer that immediately because I think about it all the time. I think it is exactly 50-50. And the reason I say that is because I think I said this earlier. I have worked with some of the best songwriters I've ever met, or best artists that I've ever met. People who when you look at the guys, the songwriters or producers who are sitting there with their armfuls of Grammys, you sitting there with all your Grammys, you cannot touch this person that I'm sitting next to just now. They are a better songwriter than you are. And they don't get their break for whatever reason. Or it takes years to get the break. And it's not because they're not writing great songs. It's just not. I guess I sort of kind of sit somewhere in the middle because I obviously had a bit of a break early on, then years of nothing, and then another break sort of meeting some of the artists that I did before they were big. But then the hard work is important. If you get the luck and you don't know how to capitalize on it, then what are you going to do? Actually, for me, I had put in so much work, so much, time, learning the craft of songwriting in all genres, learning how to be a better musician, learning how to be a better lyricist. Melody was always something that came naturally to me, so I felt like I always had that in my pocket. But then also learning how to deal with all my experiences, like we talked about, the 6 years in the wilderness, putting all that into songwriting, getting the lucky break. I suppose ultimately everybody always who works with me understands that as a songwriter, Lana Del Rey was my lucky break. But like I said, the day after that, I wasn't sitting going, bask in my greatness. I am now a songwriter. I was like, what's next? Straight on the phone to my manager saying, okay, that's the luck. Now we work. And from that point onwards, I suppose, I do get to work with some phenomenal artists and exciting artists. And, I guess in some people's eyes, famous people. But that's still me working to get to that. Like things aren't easy. It's not like you just go, oh, well, that's it now. People will phone me and I get to work. There's an element of people phoning because they know who you are, but you still got to then go in the room and write the next song and it better be good. I don't quite buy into that. You're only as good as your next song, which I know a lot of people say. I don't utterly buy into that because I think that some of my best songs maybe have never been cut or released. I think that you can be, it's the perception of you that will change. So, man, I'm telling you, it's initially 50-50, but then you better work your ass off to make up for your lucky break.
Well, that's very clear in your story. And not to mention that you may not get the lucky break if you don't rough it out for the 6 years you're talking about. So
exactly. You work to get the luck as well. That's the other thing.
For sure. So if you had to give advice to your former self, your 16-year-old self, or if it makes it easier, another 16-year-old kid, aspiring musician, songwriter, what do you tell him?
I mean, not like I haven't already spoken for 2 hours, but I've got two different answers for that. I mean, if I was speaking to myself, I you know what? I pretend to say, just do the same thing. Like I feel like the instinct that I've got has gotten me to this point. The drive and determination I've got has definitely gotten me to this point, and I've capitalized on the luck. I wouldn't tell my 16-year-old self how hard it was going to get. I'd be like, you'll be fine. Don't worry about it. I'd leave out that bit. I think that all the negative stuff and all the hard work has made me what I am as a writer. So genuinely, 16-year-old me would probably get the same thing. And it would be a different answer for another artist. If you're a sort of 16, 17-year-old songwriter, artist, I think there is extreme value in trusting your own opinion, regardless of what stage you get a record deal. You could sign, this is definitely more based on the young artists. You could sign as a 17-year-old, you could sign as a 27-year-old. Your instinct is what got you to that point. And I think once record labels and managers and the magic, even writers and producers, guys in my job, once the glitter appears, the artist can sometimes lose themselves and forget why they're in the room. You are in that room because you deserve to be there. And actually, people should be listening to you, not the other way around. And also as a songwriter, I would say that to young writers. My main task as a songwriter, I believe, is to listen to the artist. It's not to sit at the piano and write a million chords and a million melodies and a million lyrics. And anybody can do that who's at a decent level, of songwriting ability. But as a professional songwriter, if I don't listen to the artist, then what's the point? And I do know professional writers, obviously I won't name any names, But I do know people who sit and just write songs at an artist. And it's like, you are a good songwriter, but you're not releasing the song. If you get to the point of comfort and confidence, and the artist is like, I really trust you as a writer, can you write me a chorus? Then of course it's like, well, yeah, because at that point I know you and I know what you want. But until that point, if you've got any ambition to be a professional songwriter, listen to your artist. Like, they're the one that will get you through, and they're the one that will take you to probably where you want to end up. That probably goes for that. Yeah, do you know what? That's my main piece of advice. Listen to your artist. Don't just write the song yourself. It's a waste of time.
That's very interesting to hear. Also nice to hear that clearly you have no regrets, because a lot of times if you're saying, oh
no, I've got loads of regrets, they're just not in music.
Another podcast for another time. So I've just got two more questions, and then I'll let you get back to your family. What do you hope to achieve now? What is it you're after?
What a question. Well, there's something interesting. I don't know. I do want to consistently push myself, but I've always been like that as a writer. I don't enjoy like one-off songwriting sessions that don't mean anything. I like the challenge of trying to write music that's going to last. If I make 2 more records in my life with artists like, well, Lewis is a great example. I got to work with like Lewis, Sam Smith, James Bay, Hertz, and Lana, all before they were known. In fact, most of them before they were signed. In fact, all of them before they were signed. So if I get to make 2 more records in that territory where you know you're making something that's 50 years from now is going to be listened to, I think we're definitely in a moment now where music is just fucking disposable. I look at that New Music Friday every week on Spotify, and I'm having to search for the stuff that not only that I like, but I'm having to search for the stuff that I think anybody's going to care about in 50 years. I think that there's maybe an element of, let's turn over the singles, let's make money, and let's move on to the next one. Whereas I just love a body of work. I'm still a fan of an album. I'm still a fan of an artist who wants to make an album. In my opinion, it's no surprise that in the last 10 years, you look at Adele, Amy, Coldplay, Sam, now Lewis, they're all songwriters who've made albums. They're not just doing the fast turnover of single. And these are the records that people are going to be listening to, in years to come. And so that's probably my ambition, to keep looking for that type of project. And, I think that as long as I enjoy this job, and as long as it continues to pay my bills in some way, then I'll keep that attitude of just probably take it as it comes.
I love it. My last question is just like, if you're working on anything, do you want to plug it? Got anything you want to say? Last thoughts?
Having gone through the whole story about how much I hated fame and, how it took me such a long time to become a songwriter, etc. I suppose the surprising thing is that for the first time in 15 years, I have started writing for myself.
Oh, wow.
And it's taken me by surprise, I'll be honest. I've never had any ambition to make another record. That is the truth. I can swear that on my son. I just never thought that would happen. And then, sort of speaking of my son, my little boy was born 4 years ago, and he was crazy premature, and he only weighed 4 pounds when he was born. He was a tiny little thing. And at the time I was working pretty extensively on a record with Mika. Again, for Mika, it was quite a personal record. And this song was so autobiographical. I mean, it's like it lists the street, Fulham Road in London, the fact that he weighed 4 pounds, it's a real autobiographical story. And I was like, well, I can't give that to Mika. He's going to be like, what do you want me to do with this? Actually, I got to say, my wife and my manager both sort of said, well, they really loved the song. What are you going to do with it? I was like, I don't know. My manager said, record it. At least you'll have it. It's a thing to play your son. And then the strangest thing happened. As I was recording it, or beginning the process of recording it, I wrote 3 others, and it just, came like that. Boom, boom, boom. One about, my wedding day to my wife. One about, actually, it's funny, we've talked about this. I didn't even think about this. A song called Drive, which is about my drive as an artist. And I still have no ambition of fame and fortune. It's just not in me. But the thing that excites me at the moment about being an artist is that you can have entire control without anybody else getting involved. I could make a 10-track album, just put it out into the world, do it myself, and go back to work. Just be a songwriter. And that is kind of where I'm at. If I play some shows again, I think I would probably quite enjoy it on quite a low-key level. The idea of getting back on stage and performing some brand new intimate material kind of excites me. And I don't know where it's come from. You still won't catch me doing TV or interviews. But I don't know. I think that going back into it, maybe certainly older, I wouldn't necessarily say wiser, but in a place of happiness. I'm writing, every song is about the fact that, I've got a great family and I'm quite content. I'm writing about don't get me wrong, I'm writing about the dark stuff, but it is from a place of probably being quite comfortable. So yeah, I mean, I suppose that maybe that's something to look out for. I shall give you a shout when it's done.
Please do. I will be at the show if I'm in London. I would love that.
Let's hope the world gets better and you can come to London.
That would be amazing. I look forward to that. I'm really grateful to have you, man. It was an honor and very inspiring to hear your story.
I'm sorry to take up 2 days of your life.
It's my great pleasure, man. Honestly.
Cheers, Ben.
Cheers, man. See ya. You've just listened to an episode of my podcast, People Say. Thanks for tuning in and look out for more episodes soon.